Greetings. I hope you are having a wonderful day. In the last mini lecture, which was the second mini lecture on federalism, I talked about the advantages of federalism. I stole from Sharkansky and Walker, who made the claim that in federal systems there tends to be greater diversity and innovation and pluralism, and I do think that those are true. But Greg Easterbrook, who started out as an environmental critic of Ronald Reagan and later in his career, after he was the editor of the New Republic, became a huge critic of American federalism. I believe he had about a dozen things that he did not like about American federalism, and I'm stealing what I think are his best three. The first one, national actions delayed, is really a rebuttal to this notion of diversity. We tend to think of diversity as always being a good thing, and Easterbrook says that that's not always true. That at times perhaps there should be one and only one national standard. And Easterbrook kind of became famous as one of the early advocates for a nationwide 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which did occur for a while. For a little while, the United States did have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, although in many cases, Western states gave the middle finger to the national government and refused to implement it, but that's another story. I think that Easterbrook's best argument about national actions being delayed, I've put in the notes, and that is that at one time, some states had desegregated schools, and 17 states in the nation's capital did not have integrated schools. 17 states in Washington, D.C. had legally segregated schools in 1954. And so, in the Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, by a 9-0 margin, the U.S. Supreme Court said that desegregation must occur, quote, with all deliberate speed. Well, that term, all deliberate speed, is somewhat ambiguous and was interpreted and enforced very differently depending on what state you were in. In the state of Delaware, for example, all deliberate speed meant that fall, and schools were integrated. In the state of Kansas, all deliberate speed meant that fall, and schools were integrated. In Washington, D.C., in the fall of 1954, schools were integrated. But in states like South Carolina, and Mississippi, and Georgia, all deliberate speed did not mean immediately. As one Mississippi school superintendent said, one day we'll desegregate, one day. Of course, one day we'll all be dead. Meaning that, yeah, someday someone's going to do that. One day someone's going to allow black and white school children to go to school together in Mississippi, but it isn't going to be me. And if you take a look at the number in your notes, the Supreme Court in 1954 said the schools had to integrate. 10 years went by. And in 1964, 98% of black children in the Deep South still attended all black schools. In other words, they refused to implement the Supreme Court decision. And because of American federalism, the states hid behind this argument of state power and refused to implement, in this case, the Supreme Court, the highest law in the land's decision. Now, eventually, what resulted in the widespread integration of schools in the South was that money stick that I referred to earlier. Congress put financial incentives into compliance and told school districts that if you refused to implement desegregation orders, it will cost you large sums of money. And the result was by 1970, 14% of black children in the Deep South attended all black schools. Now, to be fair, that statistic is a little misleading because many school districts did the bare minimum possible to integrate and did just enough to get the money and not very much more. And so, in this case, segregation is often associated with this notion of states' rights, and it is a very, very ugly stain in our nation's history. Second, special interest domination. I'll talk a lot more about this in civil rights later on. Special interest domination. The argument here claims that the smaller the governmental unit is, the easier it is for a special interest to capture or influence the government. Think back just a couple of mini lectures ago. I think it was 4 or 5 mini lectures ago. Remember, I told you that one of the advantages of a large republic was that interest groups would have to compete, they would check and balance one another, and the larger the stage, the harder it would be for any one actor to dominate it. And that's the argument that Easterbrook is raising right here. That you can think about cities that are synonymous with a special interest. At one time in Atlanta, it was Coca-Cola. Now you might think of CNN. At one time in Seattle, you might have thought of Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer. Now you're probably more likely to think of Microsoft. In Pittsburgh, U.S. Steel. In Detroit, General Motors. And perhaps other cities, Las Vegas and gaming, for example. And you can think about this with states. The copper industry in Montana, coal in West Virginia, gaming in Nevada, natural gas and oil in Texas or Oklahoma. And the evidence does seem to suggest that it is true, the smaller the government, the fewer competitors for power on the local stage, and therefore the easier it is for an interest to dominate. And so even though we tend to think of corruption as being something that occurs in Washington, D.C., it is much more likely to exist in a smaller town or even a larger city than the national government, because there really is no countervailing power anywhere. And then finally, the third one, the lack of uniformity. That poorer areas tend to perpetuate themselves over time without the redistributed aspects of unitary government. And let me tell you a Randall story. I told you that I grew up poor. I was literally conceived on a garbage dump. When my mom quit school at 14 to marry my dad, she was rewarded by living on a garbage dump in a small shack that had cold running water but no hot water, that lacked electricity. There was a coal burning stove. There was no indoor toilet. There was an outhouse. Real poverty. Many years went by, and by the time I was in high school, my mom was back in California. My dad was back in Kentucky. I had lived with my mom in California for a while, and then I moved back with my dad. And one of the things that was very interesting about the Kentucky educational system was that schools were paid for entirely by local property taxes. So parts of the state that were more affluent, the high schools looked like colleges and universities. They were beautiful, they were immaculate, they had state-of-the-art grounds, facilities, etc. In parts of Kentucky that were poorer, and certainly we would be an example of that in Fairdale, our high school looked like a 3-story kind of old factory building. It was concrete. The School only had air conditioning where the administrators were. The heat was either rotisserie chicken, it was full blown on, or it didn't work in many cases. The facilities, frankly, were not very good. The teachers were overall outstanding, and the facilities were not very good. There was a limitation. I mean, it just wasn't very good. So after I left Kentucky, something happened in the state that, to my knowledge, has never occurred anywhere else. It may have since. I haven't followed this issue closely. I only got interested in this issue because it was my own home state. The federal courts declared the entire Kentucky school system unconstitutional and said that all schools in the state of Kentucky had to be within a certain ratio of one another. And so the result was that while the more affluent areas still got more money than the poorer areas, the gap was very, very narrow. And the result was my old high school got an influx of money, was completely refurbished. And in fact, there was a PBS special about 30 years ago, which talked about the 10 most innovative high schools in America. And my old high school was one of the 10 public schools that was featured in that PBS special. And it was intriguing because my old history teacher actually was one of the people who testified. And in the opening scene of the PBS special, he says, "None of you will ever have any idea of what this school used to look like. We always had good and great teachers, but we were very limited on the facilities, the supplies that we got." And I remember kind of chuckling, thinking, "Yeah, I remember." And his name was Mr. Strebel. He was a great guy and a really good teacher, and he courageously testified about the lack of uniformity in Kentucky schools and the school system throughout the state as a whole was elevated. I know in recent years the state of Kentucky has had some real problems because of decisions made by the governor, the former governor, which cut funding. And so Kentucky, which had gone essentially from the bottom of the food chain to the top half of school systems, has now descended down. I think the last time I looked at a ranking, it had gone from the low 20s down to the high 30s. But that doesn't have anything to do with federalism. That has to do with choices made by politicians. But the lack of uniformity in Kentucky was only overcome through the actions of the federal courts that declared the Kentucky school system unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause, and children were not getting equal access to a quality education. So I've given you three arguments for federalism. I've given you three arguments against it. And certainly, as I mentioned, I think they're true. That with federalism, you have diversity and innovation and pluralism, but you pay a cost. And the cost is that national actions can be delayed, such as segregation in the South. You have governments that are more prone to special interest group pressures and corruption. And the lack of uniformity does usually mean that it is true that poorer areas tend to perpetuate themselves over time, that in unitary systems, they tend to do a better job overall at redistributing funds to equalize regional differences. In the next mini lecture, I want to introduce you to political culture types, because one of the reasons why there's regional diversity is because people's political culture, their beliefs about what politics should do varies dramatically. And I have a connection to Daniel Elazar, and I will talk about that connection in the next mini lecture. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe. Keep in touch. Take care.